For various reasons, these Scythian videos have been delayed, but we're finally getting back to them, and this particular video, as you may have guessed from the title, is going to be exploring Amazons and the idea of female warriors. Now that being said, I just want to get one caveat out of the way. In the thousands of years of human history, there have been a lot of cultures and a lot of civilizations. So, in discussing female warriors here, I am strictly sticking to the classical world and, by extension, the Scythians. This is going to be a broad overview of the topic, but if you're interested in doing a deep dive, I've included the sources in the video description, but my aim for this particular video is one of a more conversational tone rather than anything super formal. So then let's dive right into this. Who, exactly, were the Amazons? Well, the Wikipedia page actually sums this up more succinctly than I can. So to paraphrase the opening paragraph of that page on the Amazons, they were a culture of warriors centered around women who were very well known for both their hunting skills and their martial prowess, and they show up all over Greek mythology. But as the saying goes, where there's smoke, there's fire. So does this idea of a culture of female warriors have any actual basis in historical fact? The extremely short, one-word answer to that question would be yes, although it's a yes that's going to be quickly followed by but. Because, while we do have evidence for this, the evidence is variable. Unfortunately, we don't get a nice, simple answer outside of that one-word yes. The first form of that evidence are textual sources, mainly Greek. Of those texts, the earliest that we have is the Iliad, which is usually dated to the 8th century BC in terms of actually being written down, but which is itself possibly older, and which also contains fragments of other stories from earlier periods, dating to probably the Bronze Age. So, in the Iliad, what we find is a fragment of a story known as the Bellerophon, named after the main character and the Greek hero, Bellerophon. The Amazons do show up here, and then they show up later in the Iliad as well, where the poet Homer describes them as being quote-unquote equal to men, in terms of combat and fighting ability. In addition to Bellerophon, Achilles comes into contact with them and he kills their queen. And, despite ongoing debates about the historicity of the Trojan War, the city of Troy certainly existed, and there are destruction layers, so is the Iliad accurate to any degree? If it is, when did it happen? That sort of thing. The Amazons here are generally considered to be part of the mythological aspects of the text. And if nothing else, it at least shows that the idea of Amazons and women warriors were present in the Eastern Mediterranean, and especially the Greek mind, since at least the early Iron Age, and probably the Bronze Age as well. The Trojan War is generally dated to about 1200 BC, and that's a broad date. Depending on which scholar you're reading, that might move around by 50 to 70 years. But the point is that the Amazons have been around for a while. They also show up in the labors of Hercules and in the voyages of Jason and the Argonauts. Moving away now from mythology and towards recorded history, we of course have the extensive writings of Herodotus dating to the 5th century BC, as well as earlier documents from the 6th and 7th centuries BC, which all do two things. The first is that they all locate the Amazons and their capital not along the steppe to the north of the Black Sea where the Scythians are, but rather in Pontus, approximately the northeastern Black Sea coast of modern Turkey. And while the Amazons were scattered around the area, their capital was located at Themyscira. So how did the Amazons move from there to the steppe, where we tend to think of them, and where the Scythians were, and where the two have sort of been conflated in popular memory? There are a few accounts which differ on the details, but all of which tell us that the Amazons were defeated somehow in a battle, and that they then either fled to the Caucasus Mountains and then moved to the steppe, or that they overpowered the ships on which they were being held captive, and later settled on the Eurasian steppe. Either way, the Amazons subjugate local tribes, become expert equestrians, and continue their practice of mating with men once per year, keeping the women and sending away the men. There are problems that arise here, however. The first issue is sort of abstract, and it deals with culture and the nature of textual sources, especially from antiquity. In reading these texts, what we're doing as a modern, non-ancient Greek culture is engaging in what anthropologists call the Oedic view. Essentially, we are outsiders to the culture, and no matter how much studying or care we put into it, we are never going to be able to fully understand the culture in question like we would our own, simply because we're not part of it. It's so long ago that we are simply divorced from the mentalities that shaped it. That's neither good nor bad, it's just something we need to be aware of. To go a little further here, we don't even have the culture, quote-unquote, we have a text from the culture in question, which itself is not necessarily going to be objective. History writing in the classical world was expected to adhere to certain literary tropes and motifs and to structure itself along older, more respected works. So, just as an example, is a description of a battle actually how it played out, or is it structured that way to sound like another battle, like, say, Marathon? And it's important that we keep these things in mind with this particular topic because it deals with three subjects: the other, women, and warriors. The ancient Greeks understood themselves to be, in a word, civilized. And the farther you moved outward from Greece, the less civilized you became. This is why, when you read somebody like Herodotus, you read about descriptions of things that are not exactly human, but not exactly monsters, something in between, when he writes about groups of people living to the north of the Scythians, who were culturally related to them, but who also engaged in cannibalism. And the farther you go from those people, you eventually encounter monsters in the Greek conception of the world. So the point with this is that the farther you go from the Greek world, the more alien things become to the Greeks. And you begin to see in the textual sources the inversion of what, to the Greeks, would be considered normal. Hence legends and motifs of female warriors and men being subservient to women, because in Greece it was usually the other way around. But, starting in the 7th century BC, and then really picking up in the 6th century, the Greeks began to come into closer and closer contact with the other, the nomads of the steppe, because the Greeks began to establish colonies along the coast of the Black Sea, bringing them into cultural, political, and military zones where the Scythians dominated. Now, if you were to, say, Google the Amazons or the historicity of female warriors, something along those lines, you will eventually stumble upon the Scythians and later the Sauromatians, who apparently had female warriors in their culture, and this is where the archaeology comes into play. What we need to keep in mind, however, are those Greek texts and Greek stories about Amazons and women in arms, because in terms of documents, that's generally what we have. That is to say, we have a textual record about female warriors derived from a culture for whom anything like that is very much not normal, and they sometimes make it out to be a big deal in the sense of the Amazons being a whole tribe of women warriors. In other words, you can very much get the sense that this was a presence the Greeks felt was on the steppe. But we need to exercise caution in taking archaeology to whatever degree it exists, and trying to match it to the textual record. It's not so much that the archaeology proves or disproves the idea of female warriors in Scythian culture, so much as the scale can possibly be distorted. So let's talk about the archaeology. The Scythian world stretched from the coast of the Black Sea across the steppe to the Saian Mountains, and eventually, some Scythians would move into the Carpathian Basin, and others would establish hybrid Indo-Scythian kingdoms in northern South Asia, at least for a little while. The archaeology then ranges across an extremely wide area, but for the purposes of this video, we are concerned with Scythian archaeology along the Pontic-Caspian steppe. The archaeology of the Caucasus tells us that the Scythians were present there since at least the second half of the 7th century BC. And that they were especially concentrated along the Kuban River Valley. The Scythian presence on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, however, only begins to date from the very late 7th and the early 6th centuries BC, so slightly later, with a full Scythian presence only occurring really in the 5th century BC. In that entire area, there are over 3,000 Kurgans, raised mounds denoting burials, but only 60 of those Kurgans date to the 7th and the 6th centuries. During the late 6th and the 5th centuries, the archaeology tells us that the Scythians, while maintaining their nomadic ways of life, also began to become more sedentary, founding or occupying cities and towns, and establishing closer connections not only with the Greeks, but also with the farming communities along the forest belt to their north, who in turn adopted aspects of Scythian culture like patterns of dress and burial customs. This is also where Scythian archaeology begins to overlap with the archaeology of the Sauromatians, an incoming people who appear to have been culturally similar to the Scythians, but who nevertheless replaced Scythian hegemony on the Pontic-Caspian steppe after about the 5th century, although you'll often see this period referred to archaeologically as Late Scythian due to the similarities in culture. It should be noted here that Scythian artwork appears to strictly feature men when warriors are depicted, but despite the apparent lack of female representation, we know of at least 40 Scythian graves which contain the bodies of women buried with weapons. Unfortunately, I don't have the space in this video to go over all of them, but a couple of examples should suffice. One of the burials in a collection of Kurgans known as the Three Brothers group, dating to the 4th century and located near modern-day Kerch, is notable here for two reasons. The first is that this actually contains one of the most intact Scythian bows from any period, and the second is that the body in the burial is female. Another example of a burial containing, this time not just one but actually 4 women, comes from a site near the Russian village of Devista. This is mound number 9 as it's known, and it's one of 19 such burials near the village. It has, unfortunately, been robbed at some point in the intervening 2.5 millennia, but it does contain the bodies of 4 women. The youngest was either 12 or 13 at the time of burial, the oldest was between 45 and 50, and the other 2 were somewhere in their mid-20s. The oldest woman was buried with an iron dagger, as well as several arrowheads, which presumably were once attached to arrow shafts which have since decayed, while one of the other women in their 20s was buried with 2 spears. It's possible the other 2 had weapons which were subsequently stolen when the tomb was robbed, but we are not sure. Now, ordinarily, it would be wise to exercise caution here. Just because somebody is buried with an object, like, say, a dagger, that does not necessarily have to mean that the individual in question was a warrior or a soldier. It's possible that whatever object you're looking at has some different meaning in the culture being studied when it's interred with a body versus when it's used by the living. And for a long time, since at least the 1930s when Scythian Kurgans really began to be opened, that was the general view. These tombs had been ransacked and robbed. So the fact that the 2 examples brought up a moment ago had 4 complete female skeletons in one, and a partially complete female skeleton in the other, plus a bow, and that these have survived over 2,500 years in the condition that we have them today is, frankly, amazing. It's just one of those things you need to be aware of and need to keep in mind. We're talking about events and cultures from thousands of years ago, and the fact that we know anything about them at all is in some ways nothing short of astounding. And it is precisely because the Scythian Kurgans are in such poor conditions that the idea of warrior women was not exactly taken seriously for so long. Archaeologists may very well have excavated dozens of graves with women and their weapons in them, but because they've been ransacked, all they may have is 1 or 2 bones, which does not necessarily tell them anything at all. However, with the advent of DNA sequencing and other related techniques, we now know that over 300 of these partially complete skeletons, which do have war wounds, and which are buried with weapons, are in fact female. Moving on from the Scythians to the Sauromatians, who may or may not be the same people as the Sauromatians who came slightly later, we have further evidence of warrior women. Pseudo-Hippocrates, an anonymous writer so named because the texts are included in the Hippocratic corpus, tells us the following about these people and their female warriors. In Europe, there was a Scythian race called the Sauromati. Their women ride on horseback, use the bow, and throw the javelin from their horse, and fight with their enemies as long as they remain virgins. They do not lay aside their virginity until they kill 3 of their enemies, nor have any connection with men until they perform the sacrifice according to the law. Whoever takes to herself a husband gives up riding on horseback unless she is obliged to by the necessity of a general expedition. At the very least, it would appear to further back up the assertion that the Sauromati, like the Scythians before them, had a culture in which women could become warriors. At the site of Chertomlik, 50 warrior graves have so far been excavated, and 4 of the warriors have been confirmed to be female. Going a bit further, approximately 1/5 of all Sauromatian warriors that have been excavated have now been confirmed to be women. An example of this would be the burial ground at Pokrovka, near the Russian-Kazakh border, where about 94% of all the male graves contained weapons, but so did about 14% of all female graves excavated in the cemetery, indicating perhaps that this was indeed a warrior burial ground. The investigation of Scythian and Sauromatian burials is an ongoing process, with several dozen being examined to varying degrees over the past 3 years, And as that investigation continues, it would not surprise me if our knowledge of warrior women in the region continues to evolve. Despite the mythologizing and the othering aspects of the Greek worldview when it came to the steppe north of the Black Sea, there does appear to have been some truth to tales of warrior women and Amazons riding along the grasslands and the Pontic coastline.